Welcome to the North Suburban Library District virtual program entitled Harlem High School: A Short History. My name is Joanna Mladic, and I am the local history librarian at the North Suburban Library District. So this virtual program will explore a short history of Harlem High School. Throughout this program, there will be quotes and jokes made in the student newspaper called the Harlem Pepper. They add some humor and fun break points along the way. We'll talk more later about the student newspaper and other student activities later on. As a disclaimer, some of the records shown in this program may be difficult to view. These records span the history of the United States, specifically the 20th century, and they may present and reflect outdated, biased, offensive, and possibly violent views and opinions. And for our first joke, this one comes from the Junior Journal in December of 1932, and it is a little bit of a funny joke about why does a dog have such long legs, and it's so he can touch the ground. So over the course of this program, we'll talk about some of the following topics: the establishment of Harlem Township and the creation of Loves Park. So those are two different events, but near land that was very similar and adjacent to one another. The creation of Harlem High School and how that came about, students and student life, and then events and other fun facts related to Harlem High School. Again, we have another little break point here. A joke from the Junior Journal a month earlier in November of 1932. A fish dealer said, "Look, madame, nice lobsters. They're all alive." And a skeptical lady replied, "Yes, but are they fresh?" So prior to the European settlers arriving, indigenous tribes lived along the Rock River in what we know today as Loves Park and Harlem and Machesney Park. These tribes included the Sauk, Fox, Winnebago, and Potawatomi tribes. The map on the slide is from 1765 and belongs to the digitized collections of Augustana College of the John H. Hauberg papers. It depicts an understanding of the European perspective of where Native Americans lived during the latter half of the 18th century in Illinois. And just as a reference point, in the 1830s, following the Black Hawk War, Native Americans were compelled to sell their lands to the U.S. government. Now, once these lands were sold and came into the ownership of the U.S. government, the land of Harlem Township was then first surveyed just a few years later in 1835 and was identified as 75% timber and 25% prairie. So we still see a lot of that today. There's a lot of woods and forested areas in this part of northern Illinois. The name Harlem was given in 1850 when Winnebago County adopted township government. The name was derived from the Dutch settlement on Manhattan Island, which was named for a city in the North Holland province in the Netherlands. So the first title holder in Harlem Township was named Henry L. Simpson, and he claimed as the first title holder on October 29th, 1839. The village began in a little bit later, about 6 years later in 1845, with the organization of the Harlem Methodist Church. The photograph on the slide was one of the first public school districts formed in Winnebago County called the Free Soil School District, and we'll talk about this a little bit later on another slide. The first settler of Loves Park was named Elizabeth Strawn. On November 3rd, 1843, Strawn purchased 80 acres of riverfront property between River Lane Road and Shorewood Park. She was a 34-year-old widow with a household of 5 to support. This is fairly unusual for this time period. Women were not always allowed to purchase land in their own name. However, because Strawn was a widow, she would have had slightly more rights than an unmarried or even a married woman at that time in the 1840s. Love's Park is named after Malcolm A. Love, who bought 236 acres on the Rock River East Bank in 1901, and this tract of land was called Love's Park with an apostrophe, or sometimes called Love's Grove. From those 236 acres, the site of the first subdivision, which came out to be 95 lots, was created. And then just a year later, in 1902, the interurban rail line connected Love's Park from Rockford to Janesville and all of the stops in between. So Roscoe, Rockton, Beloit, and this really contributed to the growth of Love's Park at this time. On the slide is an undated picture of the interurban rail line, and this would have been where folks could get on, get off. They could travel to work, they could travel and go on picnics, enjoy their afternoons on the weekends. It was just a way for them to really connect with other communities in the surrounding area. So the spelling of Love's Park changed around 1925 when journalists began to omit the apostrophe. And Love's Park was incorporated on April 30th, 1947. As a side note, this was 3 years after the North Suburban Library District was formed in 1944. And its incorporation was following a 2-decade-long debate about whether Love's Park should be annexed with Rockford or incorporated as a separate entity. So the spelling without the apostrophe was used at incorporation, and it was the first municipality created north of Rockford. In 1854, the position of State Superintendent of Public Instruction was created by the Illinois General Assembly. And so we're going to switch gears a little bit here and talk about the formation of the Harlem School District. But as I said a moment ago, in 1854, the position of State Superintendent was created. And then 1 year later, in 1855, the first bill for free public education became law in Illinois. In 1861, the first public school districts were created in Winnebago County, and of those, 4 would form the foundation of Harlem. These included District 61, which was the Union School, District 56, which we saw a moment ago in that photograph on the previous slide, which was the Free Soil School, District 52, the Bruner School, and District 49, the Lovejoy School. So if we fast forward to 1906, a merger between schools was proposed by O.J. Kern, who was the Winnebago County School Superintendent. And on March 12, 1910, voters petitioned the Harlem Township trustees to consolidate the schools. A month later, on April 10, 1910, the trustees approved this consolidation, and the boundaries of the school district extended north of Rockford to the southern Roscoe boundary. The first elected school board included 3 members: O.H. Conklin, Junius C. Snow, and Andrew J. Lovejoy. And the board's first action was to issue a $17,700 bond to build the school. This equates to approximately $567,000 today. As we know, building costs have gone up with with COVID and all of the supply chain issues that have been going on. And so building a new building or even building a new school today, $567,000 may not even cover the majority of the costs, which now today would probably range in the millions of dollars. The new school was completed at Harlem Road and North 2nd Street at the original site of the Free Soil School and was dedicated on April 26, 1916. A few years prior to that, in 1911, the Harlem Athletic Association established 2 track teams, a baseball team, and a girls' basketball team. In the summer of 1911, the school band was organized. And that following year, in the fall of 1912, the 4-year high school began. The curriculum included agrology, biology, chemistry, the domestic sciences, including cooking and sewing, mechanical drawing, physical education, and physics. In 1913, Linnea Larson and Ward Fabric were the 2 members of the first graduating class. As a side note, also in 1913, the principal's salary was about $100 a month, which today would equate to about $3,200 a month in 2024 dollars, and teachers made $60 a month, about $1,900 in today's dollars. So on the slide, the photograph on the left is of B.A. Hoffman, who served as superintendent of Harlem from 1927 to 1941, and he directed many music ensembles and taught courses, including algebra. He was very hands-on. This was a time when faculties were much smaller, and everyone had to be a contributing member and working directly with students. And they did not only serve an administrative role, they also served as a direct teaching faculty member as well. The photograph in the middle is of Harlem High School in the 1930s, and this photograph was featured in the yearbook, The Meteor, in that year. The student newspaper, as I said earlier, the Pepper, featured members of the senior class in Who's Who columns. So this is another little break here. And in each edition, they did these Who's Who columns to help everyone get to know their classmates who would be graduating and test their knowledge of them as well. So this one is from March 1951, and often these were short descriptions of students. They included sometimes a physical description, their favorite foods, pet peeves, and likes and dislikes. And they were the original profile that we might find online today. So this Who's Who is a senior girl. She has brown hair, brown eyes. She's 5'5" tall. She likes St. Thomas, which was actually one of the biggest rivals of Harlem at this time in their basketball and football teams. She wears a boy's ring. She's interested in home ec and never goes by her real name and is nice and friendly. So it gives you a little bit of insight into who this person was as a graduating senior, and that she has maybe a very specific nickname, and that she's a member of the senior class, and gives a chance to get to know her a little better. So again, time for another little break here. This one is from the April 1951 edition of the student newspaper, and talks about Joe asking what was your last job, and Mo answering that I was a diamond cutter, and Joe saying, "Oh, you're a jeweler, huh?" And Mo replying that I trimmed the grass at the baseball park, also known as a diamond, so rather a clever joke that they included. Students were very active at Harlem during their high school years and even beyond in their role as alumni. In the final editions of the Pepper at the end of each year in April, May, and June, the seniors were featured, including many of their culminating events, which are similar to those we see today, including commencement and baccalaureate. Some that may not be as familiar to us now include the Senior Mother's Tea, which is an event hosted entirely by the senior class, and everyone's mom or mother figure was invited to attend and have an afternoon tea, including cakes, sandwiches, coffee, tea, all again hosted and provided by the students as a thank you to their moms and those who served a mother role in their life. So plans for the future were also included in these editions of the Pepper. Their plans were as varied as those of students today. Some planned on joining the workforce, others planned to join the armed forces, go on to college, and some even chose to get married after their graduation. So following graduation, as I said, students continued to be active in the Loves Park community. One example is Arthur Anderson, who helped to start the local history room at the North Suburban Library, and also the Field of Honor Veterans Memorial Park that we see today in Loves Park, right off of Riverside Road. Others, like Joe Sinkovic, went on to become the mayor of Loves Park and served 5 terms in that role, and many others who went on to be very much a part of their communities, both here and elsewhere. So the Harlem Yearbook, as I'm sure many of you know, is called The Meteor, began in 1932, and is still known as The Meteor today. Only seniors at this time were allowed on the staff, and they actually tried out to be members of the staff and to be a part of the yearbook publication. And it was a way for seniors to memorialize their time at Harlem. And one way they did this in the yearbook as well as in the student newspaper was known as a senior class will. The one from the class of 1933, the beginning is featured on the slide, and even might be a little bit hard to read, but it does say, "We, the class of 1933 of the Harlem Consolidated High School, County of Winnebago and State of Illinois, being of sound mind and memory, and free from any wrongful or improper restraint or influence, do hereby make, publish, and declare this to be our last will and testament in the following words." So these class wills were a funny way for students to leave their mark prior to graduation. Each student would often write down something that they either felt was special to them, maybe their locker or a specific book from the library, and they would will it to an underclassman who was coming up behind them. Sometimes they would will their pet peeves or their cars, or it's a funny way to memorialize their time there. As I mentioned before, the student newspaper, the Harlem Pepper, actually began October 28th, 1932. Originally, it started out being known as the Junior's Journal. That was its first iteration. And the student newspaper, there are indications that it may date back to the late 1920s, according to an issue that wrote a very brief article about the newspaper's history. However, I have never seen any issues dating back that far, but would be curious to know if that is really true. The right side of this slide, the picture depicts the first newspaper staff from the 1933 yearbook. So that was the entire staff of students who worked on the paper that year. The name of the paper was actually changed later in a student competition. Students were able to submit their best name for the student newspaper and their reasoning, and the name Pepper won out. It's also sometimes referred to as the Harlem Pepper. Students, as I mentioned before, had to try out to be a member of the newspaper staff. They were brought on to see what types of stories they wrote and how well they wrote them before they made the cut of becoming permanent members of the staff. Juniors and seniors were usually the only members of the staff. Although this did later ease a little bit to include freshmen and sophomores as a way for them to learn how the paper was published and be able to take over as the junior and senior classes graduated. Prior to having the newspaper printed by a printing house, the Pepper was completely published at Harlem, including being edited and mimeographed for distribution. Students and the community could subscribe to the Pepper weekly or yearly. They could even opt into a delivery service from their home, and the student newspaper offered a way for parents and the community to remain up to date on the events and gossip going on at Harlem High School. So there were also a lot of sports being started in these early years at Harlem. Football, basketball, and track were the main sports for men at Harlem. There were baseball and swimming teams as well. The H Club was organized in the fall of 1930 as the athletic organization where boys could earn their athletic letter. Letters and numerals were awarded at a banquet each year. The girls, a little bit ahead of their time, which is wonderful to see. The Girls Athletic Club was organized November 5th, 1931, and eventually became known as the Girls Athletic Association, or the GAA as it was sometimes referred to. The club's purpose initially was to familiarize all girls with outdoor sports, including hiking, skiing, skating, tennis, and gymnasium work. Over the years, however, the number and types of sports also increased. So some examples include basketball, baseball, and swimming. And because Title IX had not been put into effect yet, inter-school competition between women's teams was not allowed at this point, and instead they held inter-class tournaments to determine which class had the best team. Members of the GAA could earn numerals and letters as well, similar to the H Club, and they were based on their participation in the association's activities each year. The GAA held an initiation night to induct its members, and they held contests and made the initiates do funny things like sing songs or dance to become members. And all of these initiation nights were organized by the club's executive council. The Harlem had a very active theater program. Class plays were held each year by the junior and senior classes. The juniors performed their class play usually in the fall, and the seniors held their class play in the spring. Students helped to pick out the play, put on the performance in its entirety, and were very active in putting on the production sets, lighting, makeup, hair, and wardrobe. They were a part of all of those pieces of bringing the play to the stage. In 1931, the junior class play was called The Touchdown, and the senior class play was The Nut Job. A picture of the 1931 senior class play is on the left-hand side of the slide. So in addition to sports and theater, students were active in other clubs and organizations as well. Despite Harlem being a small school at this time, there were quite a few clubs and orgs that were available for students to pick from. A couple of examples include the Camera Club, which hosted events such as movie nights, and they also had camera equipment available for students to learn how to use and try it out. They also learned about developing the film that they took. This was back in a time when they shot film and it all had to be developed in a dark room, and students were able to learn that entire process from the beginning of taking the photograph all the way through the development of the film. The Pep Club helped support the sports teams at their games. They held cheer contests to see who could create the best cheer, and had specific uniforms that they wore to distinguish themselves during the game. The Augustan Society, they worked on beautifying the school. So they painted They cleaned lockers, they made curtains, they hung pictures, and helped to create a welcoming environment for students and faculty alike. They tended to raise funds through dances and magazine subscription sales to help fund their projects to bring new life to the school. The Glee Club was very successful in competitions. They had an all-women's, an all-men's, and mixed choruses. They were able to compete both individually, either vocally or with their instrument as well. And like I said earlier, B.A. Hoffman helped contribute to the success of these programs through instruction and support of students. The orchestra grew slowly, but did eventually take off. They competed in local and state competitions as a whole orchestra, but students could also compete in trios and quartets. And sometimes students from the orchestra would be featured individually or as a group on the local radio. They also eventually went on, as we still see today, playing at football and basketball games. One final thing that I want to share about the student life of Harlem High School were, of course, dances and social events that happened for students during their time as high schoolers. They still had junior-senior prom, and as it is today, it was a very momentous occasion at Harlem. Students spent months preparing for the event, including picking the theme, decorating the gym, choosing the band that would play, organizing the food and punch, preparing the program, and organizing the receiving line. Students were organized into committees to complete these tasks. Attire and dates were also chosen very carefully for the prom, and gossip such as this was often written about in the Pepper. You'll see that there's gossip about who's going with who's wearing what color they're wearing. All of it was very well shared about in the student newspaper. And a prom queen was annually elected, and her court was formed from those who were nominated to be queen. And usually the queen from the previous year would be in attendance to crown the queen of that current year, who would be taking over the mantle of prom queen. Other dances, as I said, were held throughout the year by various clubs and organizations. They were used as fundraisers to support the club's activities and events. So as I've mentioned a few times, information was shared through the student newspaper to keep students, faculty, alumni, and the greater community up to date on what was happening at Harlem. As an example, during World War II, the student newspaper published information about alumni and students who had joined the war effort. They told about where they were stationed, what they were hoping to do in the military, and interestingly, many hoped to become pilots by joining the Army Air Corps. Some female students also joined the war effort by becoming a part of the Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service, also known as the WAVES. Students supported the war effort. They advertised war bonds in the student newspaper. They collaborated on victory gardens. They wrote letters to soldiers and sent care packages with homemade items such as socks and mittens, books, and information about what was going on at home to soldiers. The 1942 Meteor was dedicated to the students, graduates, and postgraduates who were serving their country in the military. The yearbook listed their name, rank, graduation year, and where they were stationed. Lawrence Funk was killed in the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, and his name was printed at the beginning of the list. As you can see on the slide, this is the listing from the Meteor that year. Other events that occurred at Harlem High School included, in the summer of 1945, the PA system was installed at Harlem, and students commented in the Pepper, quote, "Despite its years, our school building is becoming very, very modern," end quote. And in October of 1945, one of the teachers, Lola Barkley, who was also an alumnus, she contracted polio, and another teacher was helping to substitute for her classes until she could return. So throughout the 1940s, the local newspaper, the Loves Park Post, also reported on the outbreaks of polio that occurred in the Loves Park area. Students were affected, faculty were affected, families were affected, and one student actually was sent to a hospital in Georgia while she recovered. But just to give you an idea that there was a lot going on, both at Harlem and in the community at large. And the community was very supportive of Harlem, as it is today, and that there was much support and information being shared, both internally within Harlem and in the community at large. So these are the citations used in the creation of this virtual program. And please don't hesitate to reach out if you have questions concerning the North Suburban Library's local history room contents, or if you have other questions about what you've learned today in this virtual program. The local history email is localhistory@northsld.org, and our phone number is 815-633-4247. Thank you again for joining us for this virtual program. I hope you've learned a little bit about the history of Harlem High School and its impact in the community in Loves Park and McChesney Park, and that there are many similarities between students of yesteryear and students of today. Thanks so much.